Now, when it comes time to actually writing your story, in terms of choosing a structure to organize your story, it really depends on what kind of story you write. You may recall in my previous video on writing leads, I mentioned how you should use a summary lead for hard-breaking news stories, but use a creative lead for other types of stories such as profile stories and enterprise stories. Well, there's somewhat of a similar dichotomy or division when it comes to organizing your news stories. Hard-breaking news stories, like the ones you'll be writing on your exams in our class, are usually best organized in what's known as the inverted pyramid format. In this format, the most important information comes first, and in each successive paragraph, the information is a little less important. It's called an inverted pyramid because it's like a pyramid that's flipped upside down. So the base or the foundation comes first. In other words, we tell readers the most important information right away by beginning with a summary lead in which we summarize the story in one sentence. After that, we add facts and details based on a hierarchy of what's the most important information. This way, the reader doesn't have to read all the way through the story to find out the most important information. They can glean that from just reading the beginning, and if they want more details, they can read on. There are two reasons why we organize hard-breaking news stories in this way. When it comes to breaking news, such as which candidate won the election or which team won a game, readers want to know the results right away. They don't want you to dance around the issue, beat around the bush, or tease it out. The second reason is inverted pyramid structured stories are easier for editors to edit. If a news outlet is facing a deadline and needs to trim a story, the editor can delete from the bottom up and the story will still make sense and have the most important information. Although journalists don't have to trim as much if they're posting their stories online because a website doesn't have the same space constraints as a physical newspaper, they still do face those deadline pressures. In fact, in the age of online journalism, the deadlines are even tighter. The deadline is basically as soon as you can get it up online. So the inverted pyramid story structure is important to know now more than ever. A close cousin of the inverted pyramid is what's known as the Martini Glass format. It works like this. You begin with an inverted pyramid summary of the story's most important facts. This is usually just a few short paragraphs. Once that's done, you shift into a chronological order of what happened, and then detail what happened step by step. If possible, end with a kicker, a surprise twist, or a strong closing quote. This approach works well for crime stories especially. So for example, you might lead with a summary lead explaining how someone was arrested for allegedly committing a crime. You might add some details, and then you might provide or describe the incident from the beginning to the end, and before ending it with a kicker. Now, sometimes these story structures aren't the best way to tell your story. The inverted pyramid doesn't work for every type of story. Imagine, for example, the story of Goldilocks in the inverted pyramid format. It might go something like this. The three bears lived happily ever after, once upon a time before Goldilocks ate all their porridge and broke Baby Bear's chair. That sounds silly, right? So, if you're not writing a hard-breaking news story, you should try a different approach for organizing your story. And organizing your story is like writing a creative lead in that you have many different options. Every story unfolds differently. There is no simple one-size-fits-all solution for organizing stories. I highly recommend, though, creating an outline and carving out your story into a few big chunks. For example, if you're writing a profile story, you might organize it this way. Begin by providing an overview of the person you're profiling. So start with a creative lead. It might be a scene-setting lead, an anecdotal lead, a list lead, or some other type of creative lead. Immediately after your lead, have your nut graph where you briefly summarize who the person is and why they're newsworthy. And then after that, it's good to include a quote so the reader can hear the voice or words of the person profiled. So all of that is sort of the first part of the story, an overview of the person. In the second part of the story, you might provide the person's backstory. So you sort of travel back in time and explain how did he or she get interested or started in their profession or hobby or whatever it is they're doing that makes them newsworthy. And you can provide details on that along with quotes and anecdotes related to that. And then finally, you can conclude by talking about the present or the future. What is going on in the person's life now? Here you can elaborate on what they're doing currently that's newsworthy. And you might also talk about what the person has planned for the future. Now, if you're writing another type of story, such as an enterprise story, you can also make an outline and carve it into a few broad categories. For example, if you're doing an enterprise story about a problem or an issue and exploring what's being done to fix this, you might organize it this way. You could begin by talking about what the problem is, and don't forget to include a lead and nut graph. Then you can explore what this problem means. What are the consequences of this problem? Finally, you can conclude by looking at what's being done to fix the problem. There is no simple one-size-fits-all solution for organizing stories. Every story unfolds in a different way, but there's nothing random about good writing. Every story needs a beginning, a middle, and an end. And as you move from the beginning of your story to the end, and from paragraph to paragraph, be sure to include transitions. Transitions are words or phrases which keep the story flowing smoothly and let the reader know that you're either talking about the same thing as before or you've changed subjects. Your story must logically flow from one idea or one paragraph to the next. Otherwise, it will sound choppy if you discuss one idea and then switch to a completely different idea, unless you use a transition. For example, take a look at the story on the screen. Now, this is a hypothetical story, not an actual story that got published. But let's pretend that Michelle Obama, the former First Lady of the United States, decided to visit campus to honor students involved in bettering the community. A story about that might read something like this. President Christine Riordan said former First Lady Michelle Obama plans on honoring 25 Adelphi students who performed more than 200 hours of community service last year. I bet those students never thought Michelle Obama would honor them for their community service, Riordan said. Senior Darrell Butler, one of the seniors who will be honored, volunteered more than 300 hours at the Garden City Food Bank last year. I learned so much working there, Butler said. I am excited Mrs. Obama is honoring us, but my real reward is helping people in our community. Now, the story on the screen flows well from one paragraph to the next. But now let's say that Michelle Obama is also going to be doing something else besides honoring students. You should include that in your story, but you're probably going to need to have a transition. Whenever you switch ideas or change gears in a story, use a transition to indicate that. Transitions usually are prefaced with words such as in addition, however, but, subsequently, for example, on the other hand, in the meantime, after that, later on, etc. So for example, let's go back to our hypothetical story. Let's say Michelle Obama will also be talking to students about the importance of voting in the upcoming election. You might work that into your story this way. After writing about the main point of her visit, which is to honor community service students, you might write something like, in addition to speaking about community service, Obama plans to talk to students about the importance of voting in the upcoming election. So that, in addition to speaking about community service, serves as our transition. It indicates to readers that the story is making a turn and we're no longer talking about community service. Otherwise, if you just wrote the part about community service and then you had a quote from Michelle Obama about the need to vote in the upcoming election, it wouldn't make sense. The reader would be confused. The reader would think, why did the story go from talking about community service to talking about voting? What does voting have to do with a community service award? So transitions are the glue and signals that hold our story together and indicate to readers we're making a turn or covering a new point. So to recap all of this, you want to make an outline, Write out the different parts of your story, and then go and connect any rough transitions or new points by using transitions. That signals to readers that your story is taking a new turn, or going backwards or going forward, or in some new direction. So in closing, remember that journalism is not free writing. Before you start typing up your story, sit down and jot down the highlights. Organize your ideas, create an outline, carve out a few broad sections, and fill those in with relevant information. Use transitions to move from one idea to another.